Hello there, folks. I cover an awful lot of shameful conduct from either conservative politicians or right-wing media figures, but even I am on occasion left open-mouthed by the behaviour of some of the charlatans we have elected into public office. This is Brendan Clarke-Smith. He's the MP for Bassetlaw. For the first time in Bassetlaw's history, the seat turned blue in 2019. It is very much part of the Red Wall, and is one of many seats expected to return to the Labour Party next time around. Unfortunately for Bassetlaw, they are stuck with Brendan Clarke-Smith for now, as are the other former Red Wall seats that turned blue in 2019. Think Lee Anderson in Ashfield, for example. It would appear these Red Wall Tories have calculated their only chance of hanging on to their jobs at the next general election is to attach themselves to Boris Johnson like a crew of leeches. They view Boris Johnson as some kind of political messiah, a man who is able to transcend communities through his personality alone, and they owe him massive amounts of loyalty, because make no mistake, the people of Bassetlaw were not voting for Brendan Clarke-Smith in 2019, they were voting for Boris Johnson. These Red Wall Tories are largely empty vessels with all the appeal of a shit sandwich. Without Boris Johnson, they are dead in the water, so they will do anything to prostitute themselves to the memory of the blonde buffoon, as this interview with Victoria Derbyshire will demonstrate. But sadly, it gets even worse than that. Brendan Clarke-Smith doesn't only suffer from an integrity deficiency, he's also just a really ghastly individual. And here is why. Louise Bennett lost her 14-year-old son Fred to leukemia during the pandemic. I don't need to speak for Louise, she can tell you her own story in her own words. But what I really would like you to note is how eloquently this woman speaks about what is clearly a difficult, traumatic subject, with Brendan Clarke-Smith sat directly opposite her at the time, and how her words seem to have absolutely no impact on him whatsoever, as he continues to head out to bat for the disgraced Boris Johnson, with the bereaved mother sat directly across the table. A more pathetic display you will not see. I will play this through in its entirety. Let's take a look, shall we?
First, what's the response from a mother who lost her 14-year-old son during the pandemic, not from COVID, but from leukemia? Louise Bennett from Warwickshire is here. Welcome to Newsnight.
Thank you.
And according to this committee, you were misled deliberately by the then Prime Minister of the country on 9 different occasions.
Yeah, and I think looking at Boris Johnson in Parliament when he was talking about it, it was clear that he was lying. There was no way that those facts that we were presented with could be construed in any other way. But you watched it and you were like, well, actually, this is the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is standing at the dispatch box and saying that things categorically didn't happen. So you almost start to sort of question yourself and think, well, maybe the rules, maybe it was me that misinterpreted the rules. Maybe, we were being overcautious. So I think it's really important that today somebody or the committee has stood up and said, no, you did the right thing. You were behaving properly and he has lied to you to just save his career for a little bit longer.
When the pandemic began, your boy, Fred, 14 years of age, was being treated in Birmingham Children's Hospital and later Great Ormond Street. And you and your husband had to make very difficult decisions, painful decisions about who would spend time with him in the final weeks of his life.
Yes, so for a while we were able to swap over, so one of us could stay with Fred while the other one was at home. As the pandemic progressed, the rules changed so that when we went to Great Ormond Street, only I was allowed. My husband wasn't allowed in the hospital for quite some time. And then Fred's condition deteriorated so badly that the hospital decided that my husband was allowed to come. So we could be together for, I think, possibly the last sort of 10, 11 days of Fred's life. But our younger son, who was having to bubble 100 miles away with my family, didn't see Fred for the last sort of 3 to 4 weeks of his life.
How do you feel about that? I think we have got some beautiful pictures of Fred, actually. Yeah.
I think, obviously it was really difficult and it was always going to be a heartbreaking and really difficult thing to go through. COVID made it far more complicated and far more traumatic and far more difficult. But we understood why that was necessary. We wanted to keep everybody safe. We wanted to keep the hospital staff safe, who were doing incredible things and going to incredible lengths to look after us. So we had no problem with obeying the rules because they needed to be obeyed. It was an unprecedented situation that we had to deal with.
What's your message to Boris Johnson, if you have one?
I think my message to Boris Johnson was that our morale really needed boosting, and the morale of every doctor and nurse who looked after us at that time really needed boosting. In the time Fred was in hospital and in the months afterwards when we were grieving at home by ourselves, we didn't have cheese and wine in the party after Fred's funeral. We went home by ourselves because that was what he told us to do.
Thank you very much for being with us, Louise Bennett. Brendan Clarke-Smith is here. We'll talk to him in a moment. I just want to tell you a little bit more about Boris Johnson's statement. He said today was a dreadful day for MPs and democracy. This decision means no MP is free from vendetta or expulsion on trumped-up charges by a tiny minority who want to see him or her gone from the Commons. Mr Clarke-Smith was elected as MP for Bassetlaw in 2019, a seat that had been Labour since the 30s, and you credit Mr Johnson for that win, I know. How do you respond, first of all, to Louise Bennett?
Well, first of all, I'm very sorry to hear about Fred, and you have my sympathy. And as a parent, I can imagine it must be the absolute worst thing in the world. I was bereaved during COVID as well.
Exacerbated by the fact that the Prime Minister was lying to her.
But as was, of course, Boris Johnson. He spent time in ICU himself, of course. I'm sure he completely understands. But again, exactly what this is about today, this is about Parliament in particular. And, we're not re-examining COVID as a whole. Lots of tragedies happened during COVID all around the world. It's a terrible thing, of course, and we tried our best with that.
Do you want to say anything about the fact that the committee, the report, which Boris Johnson has called a lie, you have called the report spiteful, vindictive, and the committee a kangaroo court? I mean, why are you indulging in what the committee calls a campaign of abuse and intimidation?
Well, I'd say they've overreached as well there. And again, it was very specific parameters. They were looking at what he said in Parliament. Now, Boris Johnson, he's given evidence to the committee. He's sent evidence in there as well, and he's been very clear.
And they decided he lied. He misled on 9 occasions.
But unless they've got a crystal ball, how they can know that he intentionally did that, I don't know. I don't know what other people are thinking, of course, and what Boris Johnson said.
Have you read this report?
I have, and the information that Boris Johnson was given by people who he'd asked for that and he was briefed on. Now, this happens all the time with ministers where they will go to the dispatch box, they will give a statement on something, and sometimes the facts will change later on. They'll find out extra information, they will come to the dispatch box, they will correct the record, as Boris Johnson did.
He didn't do that, according to this report. He didn't do that.
Well, Boris Johnson corrected the record at least a couple of times.
No, not according to the committee's report today. Are you sure you've read it?
Well, which specific bit are we referring to that he didn't correct?
They said he purported to come to the Commons and correct the statement. But they weren't satisfied he had. That was another contempt.
Well, I've sat in the House myself where Boris Johnson has stated quite clearly that things had gone off in Downing Street. He apologised for that. Of course, there was all the furore about the FPN, which he accepted. Of course, the Metropolitan Police only considered that one event there counted that fine.
This is about lying. We're not talking about party gates and fines now. This is about lying. Anti-democratic, Mr Johnson called it. I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, it's not a case of whether it's democratic or not. I mean, democratic to elect your MPs, obviously, and it's the public who decide where we are. But what you expect is a fair hearing. You expect people to go into that without any prejudice before you start, and you expect to be able to give evidence and for it to be considered.
Now, which he did.
Well, the chair of that committee already had to recuse himself. The chair that was appointed afterwards has already been found to make comments prejudging Boris Johnson as well.
Mr Johnson had multiple occasions to give evidence. He presented written evidence. He presented oral evidence. He had 250 grand of taxpayers' money to pay for his lawyers, even though he's earned £6 million since September. I mean, you're not saying he's a victim here, are you?
Well, I wouldn't have had the inquiry in the first place, quite frankly, because I think...
That wasn't the question.
Well, I mean, the point is he is entitled to defend himself.
And he has. What was my question?
Well, he's entitled to defend himself with the facts that are there. He was very forthcoming towards the committee. He does not feel he has been treated fairly. Now, if you look at his statement that he said, he's identified a number of areas where he doesn't feel that process has been followed correctly, where they've gone outside the original remit with the definitions and so on. And then he's also raised specific questions questions about the committee itself. Now, if I were Boris Johnson, I'd want all those addressed. Now, he's resigned as an MP. He's already gone now.
Yeah. So he's avoided democracy, actually. He's chosen not to put his case to you and your colleagues in the House on Monday, and he's chosen not to face voters in his own constituency. That's how much he likes democracy.
Well, he agreed to this on the basis that he thought he would get fair treatment, and when he saw the report, he felt that that was not the case and it wouldn't be possible to actually do that.
When the committee finds he deliberately misled, he decides, oh no, I think this is an unfair process.
But the committee again has changed. They've changed from the number of days. Even today, we've heard they've added extra on for criticising the committee. Now, as a parliamentarian, you expect to be able to scrutinise, you expect to be able to object, to be able to debate. If you're not going to able to...
Not trash it, though.
Well, not trash it, no, and we accept they've got a very difficult job to do on these committees. I have a lot of respect for people who do it.
What, you're calling them a kangaroo court. Don't be disingenuous. Well, you don't have respect for them.
Well, I said I'd read the report first. I did that. I read the report when it was published, and then when I've looked into it. And if we're talking about courts, Victoria, if this were a real court of law, this would have been thrown out straight away. There is no way, on the basis that this has been set up, in terms of how it's decided, in terms of the evidence is there, that this would pass the threshold.
You're a member of the House of Commons. Parliament instructed the committee to do this. Boris Johnson set the Privileges Committee up. There is a debate and a vote on Monday on the report. You'll be voting against it.
I certainly will, yes.
Why don't you want to stand up for honesty and integrity in public life?
Well, that's what I feel as I'm doing. Now, the easiest thing in the world would be for me to either not be there on Monday or to nod it through. Instead, I'm standing up for what I think is right. And I think when you actually stand by people, that's when it actually shows some real integrity, because what we're doing is defending colleagues. Now, if it were another colleague in the House of Commons who had the same thing, I would expect them to get a fair hearing as well. I don't believe Boris Johnson has.
Those Conservative colleagues that vote for this report on Monday, assuming they turn up, should they face deselection, as Nadine Dorris has suggested?
Well, it's a free vote, and I think it should stay a free vote. It's a House matter, it's not a party political matter.
Should they face deselection in their constituencies?
No. I mean, I think it's for individual constituencies to speak to their members of Parliament about how they feel, about what promises they've made, and about what they think is reasonable and with their own consciences. So I would never go as far as saying that, no. But what I would say is that I think they should look at it. I think they should make their own decision on it. And certainly I would urge them to vote against this, because I do think it has gone too far. I think it is spiteful and vindictive. Taking his parliamentary pass away from him as a former Prime Minister is quite unprecedented.
Yeah, because he was a Prime Minister and he misled the House and the country. That's why they're suggesting a suspension of 90 days and removing the pass. It's all the more serious, the committee said, because he was the Prime Minister.
But, of course, most of this is for the criticism of the committee. Margaret Ferrier, of course, only had 30 days suspension. This is I think it's the second biggest one they've ever issued.
Yeah, this was the Prime Minister of the country, lying to the country on multiple occasions.
But they've not provided a single shred of evidence to say that Boris Johnson knowingly did this. Now, they can surmise and they can suggest that he's done it, and they can put forward and repeat it a lot, and most of us have seen this in Twitter over recent weeks. So when we talk about confidentiality, I think there's certainly an issue there as well. I don't believe Boris Johnson did. I think he said, to the best of his abilities and what he'd been provided with, I think he corrected the letter later. And I hope on Monday this will be voted down, and I'll certainly be encouraging colleagues to do that.
Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you. Brendan Clarke-Smith. Now we can speak to Lord...
Is it me, or does Brendan have a constant look of surprise on his face? It's as if his face cannot believe the rubbish he's coming out with. But what we witness there is somebody who is clearly without shame, somebody banking on Johnson making a return to politics at some point, somebody who will hope his vomit-inducing loyalty will be one day rewarded. Monday's vote will be really interesting. If Rishi Sunak has a backbone, he will vote to support the committee's findings. But that is not without risk, because he could push the Boris Johnson acolytes to breaking point. Could we see resignations and defections if Johnson hints at making a run with a different political party? Potentially, yes. There are people still naively saying Boris Johnson is a Tory at heart and wants the party to succeed, so he will go silent for a while. Well, no, because he starts his new job writing for the Daily Fail tomorrow. Or he has already started if you are watching this video at a later date. I expect he will make as much money as possible, do as much damage as he possibly can to our already fragile political system, and attempt to sneak back in at some point to pick up the pieces. Never underestimate his ability to stick around like a fart in a lift. As for Brendan Clarke-Smith, he is completely finished. He has misread the room. Yes, there are many Boris Johnson headbangers out there, but they are vastly outnumbered by rational people. In fact, the very best news about the purging of Johnsonism from our politics is not necessarily the demise of the man himself, but the demise of the kind of conservative politician that were dredged from the swamp and selected as Tory MPs in 2019 for one purpose, and one purpose only: to get Brexit done. They offer nothing else in terms of ability, integrity, honesty, or competence, as I hope this shameless interview on Newsnight has exposed. Credit to Victoria Derbyshire for calling out some of his rubbish, and full credit to that mother for sitting through such nonsense without chucking a pitcher of ice-cold water over the disingenuous bastard. Oh, God. Bloody hell. Cheers for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you would be so kind. Thank you again, everyone. Take care of yourselves, and I'll catch you again soon.